Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kaylee Lines.
President Trump threatens to walk on Ukraine. Welcome to the Friday edition, as the president gives Kyiv until Thanksgiving to accept the 28-point peace plan it offered earlier this week, even as Russia continues to bomb civilian targets across Ukraine. We'll have much more on this with a live report from the White House in Tyler Kendall. And as the president prepares to sit down with Mamdani today in the Oval Office, we'll talk it out with the gentleman from New York. Max Rose, former Democratic congressman from New York, will be with us. Army veteran, senior advisor at Vote Vets. We'll have some thoughts on the president's post about sedition. And we'll have analysis from our panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis with us for the hour. It's all ahead after a look at Wall Street, which looks a lot better today than it did this time yesterday. Time to bounce back, Charlie Pellet. What do you see?
Indeed, seeing a lot of green right now, and as you say, dramatic turnaround from this time yesterday. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the green right now. S&P holding close to session highs. We're up 78 on that index at 66.18. That's a gain now of 1.2%. The Dow up 675, have been up more than 700, up by 1.5% right now. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 231, up by 1%. Our Mag 7 Index is up by 1%. Nvidia, though, interestingly, does remain lower. A little change, down 6 cents, down less than 0.1%. The 10-year currently yielding 4.07%, with the 2-year 3.52%. Gold up $9 the ounce, $4,086, up 0.2%. A 2% loss for West Texas Intermediate crude, $57.83 a barrel. And Bitcoin now down by 2.8%, below $85,000, $84,728 on the Bitcoin. Keeping an eye on Gap shares after earnings. Gap up 8.2%. Sales came in stronger than expected, bucking the trend across the majority of retail and restaurant chains that have been warning of consumers' deepening caution in recent weeks. Again, Gap shares, they're up now by 8.2%. Also out with earnings, Ross Stores, that stock up by 7%. Again, recapping, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all higher. S&P up 74 right now, up by 1.1%. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie, great to see you. Charlie Pellet on a Friday. What else do you want? A market rally, and we have that too. We'll check back with Charlie in about 20 minutes time to see how things are shaping up. We are right near our highs of the day, and we've got our eyes on Bitcoin, spotted by Bloomberg's Edward Harrison as the real culprit here, as we watch Bitcoin recover from its lows of the day, but still not moving higher, down about $2,500, still south of 85,000. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Michelle Jamrisko. Thank you for being with us on the Friday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. A busy day in the Capitol, Michelle. It's great to see you as well. 2 hours from right now to be a fly on the wall. And we may be. We're still waiting to find out if press will be allowed in the Oval Office for what some think is the clash of the Titans here. Mamdani with Donald Trump. Then again, the president says it could be civil.
Well, it's hard to see him not opening this up, because it is a big show, as you like to say, the greatest show on earth in the Oval Office.
That's what he calls it.
So we'll see today on that. But of course, yeah, we're looking at the other headlines flying around Ukraine. Will we have world peace by Thanksgiving? I think that's a lot to ask at this point. So some sobering news on that front.
Well, and that's right, as Michelle points out, the president giving Ukraine until Thanksgiving. This appears to be a Thursday deadline, Thursday ultimatum to accept this 28-point peace plan that the government has largely rejected already. And President Zelenskiy acknowledging this morning in a series of calls with J.D. Vance, with Mark Rutte at NATO, that he's willing to talk, but is also prepared to lose the U.S. as a partner here, which the president is threatening.
Well, this is vintage Trump, right,
Yeah.
Joe? I mean, he lays out a deadline, but he also says, I'm flexible.
Sure.
If you give me what I want, doesn't want to give too much away because he likes to be unpredictable. So all these sorts of dynamics playing out on that front. And we're watching and waiting with intent.
Big time. These are the two plates we're spinning today as we wait for the meeting to begin at the White House. And it's possible that, of course, President Trump will be taking questions on Ukraine as well while we're in there. Let's get to the White House. Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, is on the North Lawn right now waiting for all of this. Any activity there? Tyler, we saw Mamdani tweet a photo from the plane this morning, but he's not due for another couple hours, right?
Nope, and that meeting at 3 p.m. Eastern at the moment is still closed press, though, Joe, I can tell you it is actually the busiest I have seen it out here on Pebble Beach when it comes to additional media that have come to cover this event, really compared to when we get those foreign leaders here at the White House and we see foreign media come in. We are seeing a lot of local reporters here as well because, of course, this is a high stakes and highly consequential meeting because, as you well know, President Trump has a lot of threats and criticism on the table when it comes to New York City, threatening, of course, not taking off the table that he could send in National Guard troops, he could ramp up immigration enforcement, and then, importantly, potentially withhold federal funding from New York City, as the city received about $10 billion from the federal government in fiscal year 2025 and is currently counting on an additional $7.4 billion for fiscal year 2026, according to the city's budget request. Combine that with the fact that this administration has already frozen about $18 billion worth of New York State infrastructure funds, and really we have this pressure building here at the White House. At the same time, though, you did mention that President Trump told Fox News Radio earlier today he expects this to be a civil meeting. It's our understanding that Mayor-elect Mamdani did request it to the White House. His transition team says that affordability is going to be at the top of the agenda, as we know that this White House has been trying to take back control of that narrative when it comes to costs. And Joe, of course, two headlines today. One, we're not going to get the October Consumer Price Index, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And two, University of Michigan's consumer sentiment showing that it is hitting near record lows.
Well, Tyler, a lot to unpack there. Happy Friday. There's been a lot this week, of course, and Ukraine is kind of capping the week with some more serious foreign policy news on that front. I'm wondering, what do you feel the mood is over there at the White House today? I mean, a lot of this week, we've seen the president not being kind of at his best mood. I'm wondering, how's he feeling today? What do you sense from the staff over there?
Well, we did hear from President Trump earlier today, as you mentioned at the top of the program. He says that he's giving Ukraine until Thanksgiving on whether or not it wants to decide to join on to this U.S.-Russia-led plan, though he himself did concede that his deadlines often shift. Now, I will point out that Ukraine right now is in an incredibly difficult position. As our analysts at Bloomberg Economics say, the country is currently facing a trifecta of crises that includes these recent gains by Russia on the battlefield, also an internal corruption scandal, and new data that shows that Ukraine's economy is weakening. Pile on that the new reporting out from Bloomberg News, people familiar telling us that the U.S. is threatening to withhold intelligence sharing and military supplies to the country if they don't get on board with this 28-point plan. Now, the White House says that both sides have been engaged when it comes to these talks, but according to a review of the document, it shows that Ukraine would be making significant concessions to Russia. That includes fully ceding the Donbas area, also abandoning its NATO ambitions, holding elections within 100 days of any plan, and significantly decreasing its military. In exchange, the U.S. is putting the firmest security guarantees that we have seen so far on the table, including something that could look like NATO's Article 5. Michelle and Joe, at this point, we are still waiting to see where these negotiations are going to head. It appears that the Ukrainian President Zelenskiy has been very busy with calls today. Vice President J.D. Vance reportedly, also the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and of course our European allies.
Tyler, thank you so much. From the North Lawn of the White House, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Like I said, about 2 hours away from the arrival of Zoran Mamdani, with questions about what's going to happen in that room, exactly how long he's going to be there, and of course whether reporters will be allowed inside. We still haven't learned the White House's decision on all of that. What is the mayor-elect looking to accomplish today? He talked to reporters in New York before leaving town. Listen.
This is a meeting to share the facts about the affordability crisis in the city, a meeting to speak about the importance of public safety and economic security. You know, when we speak about what New Yorkers are going through right now, they are facing a reality that they may have to leave this city.
No matter who you ask, the stakes are high, not only for the mayor-elect, but for New York. My beloved New York, as President Trump refers to the city, knowing that he's threatened to pull federal funding, Michelle, from New York if Mamdani won. Of course, he has won, and the president has already clamped down on some infrastructure spending around the city. So both will have to carry their own posture into this meeting, knowing their own respective bases are watching.
Yeah, and Trump conceding in an interview this morning that he's been hitting him a little hard when he talks about the mayor-elect. So we'll see how that kind of shows up in the politics of this, the optics, but then to your point, the policy. What's going to happen here? Are they going to get the federal funding from the government
That's right.
to New York? So.
And will they have a productive conversation about affordability, which is an issue that helped elect both of these gentlemen. Indeed, on Fox News Radio, quote, "I was hitting a little hard too, in all fairness, Donald Trump. Maybe this will be a love fest." Let's see what Max Rose thinks about this. He's got some skin in the game as a New Yorker. The former Democratic congressman from New York, Army veteran and senior advisor at Vote Vets. Max Rose, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. What's your thought going into this meeting? And is this a smart time for Zoran Mamdani to sit down with Donald Trump?
It's good to see you. Thanks for having me. I think this is very smart because New York City's not Portland. With all respect to Portland, you know, New York City represents the 9th largest economy in the world, and its success equates to the president's success. It equates to America's success. So some of the traditional tools at Donald Trump's disposal, completely cutting off federal funding, disrupting the operations of the city with massive deployment of the National Guard, I think he implicitly understands that can't be on the table when it comes to New York City. On the same hand as well, while the White House and New York City certainly need one another, I would say as politicians, Mamdani and Donald Trump also need one another as foils. So you're going to see them walking this incredibly fine line where they will look to preserve some level of economic partnership, some tertiary focus on affordability. But I also would not be surprised if we do see some level of political showmanship, some level of show business during this so they can each rev up their respective bases.
Well, Congressman, I hope I'm not being too starry-eyed here, but in a best-case scenario, for those that care about affordability and the conversation around it, even among two men who don't agree on pretty much anything, what can we hope for? You mentioned economic partnership. What could they do or say that would inspire some change on that front?
Look, under the best of circumstances, we would see the federal government maintain its pledges and promises to New York City, particularly in regards to these infrastructure projects that have been canceled. One of the points, though, here where I see the greatest conflict during this conversation is in and around immigration enforcement. You know, Mamdani has, and I think he's right to note this, has established that the NYPD should not play a role in this kind of forthright, very aggressive immigration enforcement that Donald Trump has pushed ICE towards. That is clearly against Donald Trump's agenda. So, you know, under the best of circumstances, you would see this moment where they say, let's just get down to business and grow the economy. But it just seems so unlikely considering how far apart these two individuals are.
We talked to Andrew Garbarino yesterday about this meeting and what he was hoping might come from it. Granted, a Republican said that he hoped that Donald Trump would have some tough words for Zoran Mamdani when it came to supporting law enforcement and to take back some of the things that he has said about law enforcement in the past. Is that a productive exercise?
Garbarino, and this is, I think, my point, like you can't take the politics out of politics. And with respect to Congressman Garbarino, this is an element of playing politics, right? I mentioned $18 billion in infrastructure funds. I mentioned continued federal funding to support law enforcement in New York City. Let's not forget as well that New York City is the #1 terrorist target, certainly in America and perhaps in the world. So the partnership, the national security partnership between the NYPD and the federal government is essential if you want to actually think about the future of New York City, those are the things you're going to talk about in this meeting. If you want to play politics, right, what you're going to do is you're going to talk about past statements. You're going to make it really soundbite oriented. You're going to make it very social media oriented. There's a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that would like this to be a strictly political conversation. That's not certainly for the good of New York City, but man, would it be good for the Republican base out in Long Island. That's probably where Garbarino's coming from.
Well, Congressman, if you're advising the mayor-elect on today and you want to have him use the politics for the better, what would you tell him to say on the security issue, on the safety issue, on the immigration issue that might placate the president or get him to perk up and listen? Well,
I think neither side is going to be looking to placate the other one. You cannot, they will never end up on the ideologically same side. But what's interesting here is that Mayor-elect Mamdani has an opportunity to call out Donald Trump for his failed promises on affordability. Remember, most political analysts would say that Donald Trump won because President Biden had failed on the issue of affordability, and Donald Trump highlighted it. Now, of course, it does not seem that he has really governed with affordability as a priority. Tariffs don't do anything good for affordability. Certainly, we've seen inflation continue to be a problem, the price of food continuing to go up. There is an area where if Mamdani maintains disciplined focus just on constantly bringing the conversation back to that, there's an opportunity to put Donald Trump in a very weird and awkward political situation. It should also be noted here that Mamdani is taking a political risk coming out here and sitting with Donald Trump. There's plenty of the Democratic base that would not want this moment, wouldn't want Mamdani sitting there shaking his hand, offering to do things that would help ensure, yes, New York City is successful, but also that inherently Donald Trump would be successful then, too. So they're both taking, and even Mamdani maybe more so than Trump, is taking a political risk here, I think in support of New York City.
Well, we'll see what comes of this. Max Rose, should Mamdani, if reporters are not allowed in the Oval Office, come out to the stakeout position in the driveway, talk to the media after to frame what happened?
You know, Donald Trump committed during an interview this morning to invite the press in. You know, this is going to be an Oval Office meeting.
It hasn't happened yet.
Right, but it's going to be an Oval Office meeting where, you know, it's going to look like, I think, a setup similar to what they do with heads of state. I'm not exactly sure how they're going to structure it.
They'll be at the fireplace doing the whole thing. We're just still waiting. You've got a press pool in the briefing room waiting to find out if they're invited, but we'll assume that that's going to happen.
It takes two to tango, though, right? And I would be shocked, though, if Mayor-elect Mamdani didn't decide to do that, because he's a politician and politicians love cameras. So Donald Trump already committed to doing it. So certainly I would bet that it's going to happen, and I'd be curious if it doesn't.
Yeah. It's great to have you back. Perfect voice for today as we approach the meeting in the Oval Office. Good to see you. Max Rose, former Democratic congressman from New York. Gives you something to think about, Michelle, before this session.
For sure.
Whether this is going to be a pay-per-view match or a productive meeting for the people of New York.
And hopefully a mix of both for those watching.
Hopefully. There's always little entertainment in that room and a lot of gold to go around as well. When this takes place, assuming that the cameras and microphones are allowed, you know that Bloomberg will bring you in the room for it, and we'll experience this all together. Set to be 3 p.m. Things don't always go on time at the White House, so let's say before the bell, by the grace of God. We'll assemble our panel next. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us only on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, alongside Michelle Jamrisko, as we prepare for the big meeting today in the Oval Office, and also reflect, Michelle, on the Consumer Sentiment Index out today from UMich. As we frequently hear from our friend Rick Davis, our Republican strategist, the best political poll in the business. And if that's the case, it's not great news for Donald Trump. Sentiment falling in November to one of the lowest levels on record. Current conditions gauge sliding to a record low. And guess what? Yes, consumers are anxious about costs and job security.
Well, and it lands in the middle of this frustration about not getting the official data, which we learned this morning about CPI data that we'll also miss out on because of the shutdown.
Yep.
So what do we have to rely on but this private sector data that's not looking good?
This is true. And when you put it together with the meeting that we're all talking about today, it's the biggest show in town. Trump-Mamdani, the two leaders elected on the issue of affordability, but from very different bases. Although there is some crossover, some overlap when it comes to that base, and that's why these numbers are awfully important. This is why it may not be a clash of the titans, because they both need to sell this particular message here. With sentiment in mind, and the aforementioned Rick Davis, we assemble our panel. Rick is, of course, a Bloomberg politics contributor, Republican strategist, and partner at Stonecourt Capital. And Jeanne Zaino is back with us, Bloomberg politics contributor and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Great to see you both here. Rick, against the backdrop of these numbers, is it not imperative for both of these men to succeed in a productive conversation today?
Yeah, I think it's actually an interesting dynamic because what Mamdani brings to the table is the articulation of affordability from the class of voters in New York that swept him to victory, but are not enjoying the fruits of the stock market historic levels. And what Donald Trump comes to affordability discussions is, a very much financial engineering of the economy, tariffs and the stock market and the Federal Reserve. And so the question is there are they going to talk past each other, or are they going to be able to find some place in the middle to actually think about how to do this? Because what is unique about these numbers out of the University of Michigan's sentiment index is if you are in the stock market, you have a different point of view as a consumer than if you are not in the stock market. And when we saw numbers this low during the 2008 presidential campaign because of the great financial crisis, everybody was unhappy. But the reality is there's two Americas in this survey, and one of them, luxury goods sales, record levels, that kind of thing. And then at the lower end of the economic spectrum, very, very unhappy people with the direction of the country, unhappy with their own personal financial situation, and not optimistic about the future. So this is a much more complex set of data than we've seen in previous big downturns of the economy.
Well, Jeanne, let's talk about that disconnect, because I feel like this haunts every president when you start talking about how great the economy is, and then, the feeling on the ground is just not the same. This week, we've seen White House, kind of walk back some comments in some ways. We saw J.D. Vance say, please be patient, so kind of recognizing what the mood is on the ground. If you're advising politicians now, are you telling them just operate on the vibes, fade the data, whatever it might say, because there's a debate about that? Listen to the people?
Yeah, I'm so glad, Michelle, you raised J.D. Vance. I thought that was one of the most striking things we've heard in the last 24 hours was J.D. Vance to go on and to undercut Trump's message, even going so far as to talk about one of Trump's key indicators of success, which is the price of groceries and eggs, by the way. You couple that with the consumer sentiment numbers, you couple that with the polls, which Real Clear Politics has Donald Trump 17 points underwater on the economy right now. These are stunning numbers. And I think the reality is that when he was on the campaign trail, Donald Trump was very much like Zoran Mamdani. He was out there. He was hearing from people. But now he has turned into Joe Biden. He is sort of living in this bubble of the White House. It's almost stunning what happens to people that he's living there, and he keeps saying, even as recently as this week, the affordability issue that Democrats keep raising is a hoax. And that is simply not the case. And so the advice for all politicians is to get out there and understand that you can't convince people of something that when they feel otherwise. You can't convince somebody that things are growing great. Just look at the stock numbers. When they go to the grocery store and eggs and milk and cheese and beef and everything else are costing too much. And so he should not be reflecting Joe Biden. He's got to be Donald Trump on the campaign trail. And maybe Zoran Mamdani will light a fire under him when he goes in there today, because that's what Zoran Mamdani did so beautifully on the campaign trail just a few months ago.
Rick, it's not lost on us that the House voted overwhelmingly this morning to approve a resolution condemning the horrors of socialism. 86 Democrats voted with Republicans on this. 2 others voted present. Not a single Republican voted to oppose it. And this is a self-described democratic socialist who's showing up in the Oval Office today. I'm compelled by this idea of the overlap between these two. The voter who voted for Trump and then voted for Mamdani on the same issue of affordability. What does this rare species look like to you?
Well, we saw Trump's numbers, both in the city and statewide in New York and New Jersey especially, go up this last election cycle during his win over Kamala Harris, especially with a certain cohort, young men, both white, black, and Hispanic, and other young displaced voters and a portion of young women voters. So you can imagine that some of it is generational. In other words, those voters who may have been voting independent or even Democrat in the past, didn't see the Biden administration is understanding their aspirations and certainly their needs on affordability, for instance. We always call it on the Republican side cost of living. Affordability is the new term, but it was definitely driving voters away from the Harris ticket and onto the Trump ticket. Mm-hmm. Those are some of the same voters that showed up in record numbers in the New York City mayor's election. Overwhelming support for Mamdani with voters under the age of 35. That includes this whole swath of voters that were taking a look at Donald Trump only a year ago. So I do think it's a kind of an interesting pull that's happening. And I would say Trump has the fear, frankly, of losing this cohort long term, because right now they're not happy with the Trump administration's focus on other things but the economy. And you're starting to see it in poll after poll, including one by Fox News today, that indicates a significant downturn, over 5%, in the number of Republicans that support the president's policies. And we haven't seen that kind of erosion on the president with his base, since he got into politics in 2015.
Well, Rick, if you had to pick one thing that the two men would agree on in front of the cameras today, what would that be?
I'd say, broadly speaking, they are anti-establishment, right? Trump's burning down Washington, while, the expectations are that Mamdani will burn down New York. And of course, this is figuratively speaking. But there is a suspicion that the establishment keeps people like Donald Trump and Zoran Mamdani from being successful. And so I think if they can kind of connect on that level, then there's a whole slew of issues that Donald Trump has been giving somewhat lip service to on the economy that he could actually join with Mamdani on. But I would say the big push on that is issues like immigration and things like that, which will cause a significant split. So can Trump overcome his partisan point of views and be willing to put his hand out and shake a avowed socialist hand? This is a really interesting dynamic that hasn't been seen in politics in the United States in a long, long time.
So, Jeanne, have we learned here then that affordability, cost of living, inflation, prices, whatever term we want to use, trumps partisanship among the American electorate?
Sure. I mean, for people, they want to be able to live and they want to be able to pay their rent and to pay for food. And you do see these swing voters. But I would just caution against this socialist title. Zoran Mamdani describes himself as a democratic socialist. There is a difference, number one. Number two, in 2024, Donald Trump's campaign attempted to use the descriptor of communist. And he's still attempting to use it as recently as Truth Social the other day. That was his own team said a loser for him. And the reason gets back to something Rick was alluding to. For younger generations, they don't see democratic socialism as this big boogeyman that those of us who are older and see it as a communist sort of, Cold War era type of thing. They see this in the context of being able to live a healthy and affordable life. And so I think Donald Trump's got to pay really close attention to that, because this is a clash of generations. Donald Trump is edging into 80. Zoran Mamdani is 34. But another bit of caution, Zoran Mamdani is not trying to burn anything down. He appointed a lieutenant governor who's been around New York City politics for years and is in his upper elderly ages himself, and he is keeping the police commissioner. So he is not, at least so far, we have to go, proven to be sort of a rabble-rouser who's going to go in and burn things down.
Yeah. Well, pop your corn. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Great conversation. We'll compare notes on the late edition of Balance of Power once this meeting has presumably concluded. We've got news on Ukraine and the effort to find peace next, only here on Bloomberg. We're also preparing for the big meeting in the Oval Office between President Trump and Zoran Mamdani a little more than an hour from now. That's about 90 minutes away if things stay on time. And Michelle, that's the backdrop for some pretty serious business coming out of the White House today. We've been talking for days now about this 28-point peace plan for Ukraine, one that Ukraine apparently was not consulted on. And we've had some pretty good discussions about it this week, knowing that most of this plan is a non-starter for Ukraine, giving up the land that's been occupied and then some by Russia, limiting its ability to defend itself, promising to never join NATO. But a lot has happened just in the last 24 hours on this, with an ultimatum effectively coming from the president. He says, take it or leave it by Thanksgiving, less than a week away, and a pretty remarkable flurry of phone calls for President Zelenskiy this morning as well.
Well, that's right. And who knows where this will go, Joe, in the days ahead. But I want to pick up on what you mentioned as the ultimatum, because if you listen to what President Trump said this morning, he had a very vintage Trump line. He says, I've had a lot of deadlines, but if things are working well, you tend to extend the deadline. So certainly keeping the door open for some sort of conversation, some sort of agreement, some sort of flexibility on what is being reported as a very lopsided plan in Russia's favor. That
was his interview on Fox News Radio.
That's right.
Made a lot of news there this morning on a number of topics. With regard to this one, though, we know that Zelensky has spoken today with J.D. Vance. There was a call earlier. He is supposed to speak in the days ahead with President Trump. Spoke with Mark Rutte at NATO. And we understand he just spoke with the Prime Minister of Germany. President Trump, I should say, spoke with the Prime Minister of Germany. And I'd be very curious to see his disposition coming out of that meeting. German U.S. security advisors continue discussions. The headline on the terminal, MERS to brief European leaders on a call now about what was said with Donald Trump.
Yeah, and we just don't know the readouts of the call. It's also important to note that President Zelensky released an address where he's talking about either losing his dignity or, losing the support of a key partner in the war, namely the U.S. But he recorded that, or released it at least, before he had the phone call with Vice President Vance. So there's a lot we have to learn about how those conversations went today, which are, as you say, ongoing.
The ultimatum does seem to be real, whether it's going to be next Tuesday or some other point, as you suggest. Michelle, the president has made it pretty clear to the point where Zelensky is calling this one of the most difficult moments in our history. The threat is to cut off weapons support, and there's not much left of that, but also intelligence support, which has really helped to keep Ukraine afloat in this fight beyond the hardware. That would all presumably go away by Thursday if this deal doesn't happen?
Yeah, it's unclear how that leverage is going to play out. But of course, we've seen that being pushed on both sides by President Trump, trying to leverage Putin into getting it to a deal. Now he's putting more pressure on Zelensky. It's been quite a roller coaster this year.
Is that for sure? I'm glad to say that we have Meghan O'Sullivan with us here to talk about it, former Deputy National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration, now Director of the Harvard Belfer Center. Meghan, it's great to see you. I'm curious your thoughts on the ultimatum and whether next Thursday is real.
I find it very hard to believe that a proposal this far-reaching could be hammered out in a way that would be agreeable, not just to the Russians and the Ukrainians, but to the Europeans in some fashion as well. I personally, in diplomacy, am a big believer in putting hardcore ideas on the table as a starting point, but expecting that it could be resolved and that these issues could be negotiated by Thursday seems inconceivable to me.
Well, Meghan, let's talk about the pressure on the other side, because we have the two Russian oil giants that are supposed to be sanctioned as of today. Now, President Trump said this morning that it would happen very soon. We're not clear on what that means. The first question is, are those sanctions going to go into effect, do you think? And secondly, perhaps more importantly, do those sanctions work? We've seen this time and again, administrations that you worked for and all up into the current one. Is this going to work?
So several questions there. One, are those sanctions going to go into place? I would say we don't know at this point. The whole proposal is a little bit of a surprise, because it really did seem that President Trump was moving in the direction where he understood that Putin was playing him to some extent. And so there was that momentum to put more economic pressure on Russia. My guess is that there'll be some kind of suspension while this is being worked out, and as long as there are genuine negotiations going on around these ideas in the 28-point plan. Now, do these sanctions work if they are put into place? That's a big question, in the sense of, do they work? Will they lead Russia to be more accommodating? Is hard to know, but they will have an effect on Russia's economy. So these sanctions, we've had sanctions in place on Russia now for 3.5 years, as has the European and many other countries. They have had an effect, but they haven't been implemented very strongly. And so this is a move in the direction for more economic pressure. There's frankly a lot more that could be done with sanctions, and they could be implemented even more aggressively, that would create more economic pressure on Putin, and the extent to which that will change his calculations on something that he sees as existential to his rule and to his legacy is another question.
We learned the president spoke with German Chancellor Merz a short time ago. Meghan, I'm curious what Merz thinks of this, what Macron thinks of this, what Starmer makes of this deal.
I think what we're seeing is the European leaders in private are probably very alarmed, but in public, I think they're taking the appropriate approach to say, let's see if we can come to an agreement that creates a just and lasting peace. And that's what the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said on his way to the G20 meetings, that, we're all interested in the same objective. Now, this agreement or this proposal, as we've seen it and the provisions discussed, has major implications for Europe. This is not just about Ukraine. This essentially would say that NATO can no longer expand. Keep in mind that Sweden and Finland just joined NATO last year. This is something that the Europeans will want to have a say in. It also limits and downsizes what is currently Europe's largest and most battle-tested and probably most technologically innovative military on the entire continent. So that is something that the Europeans will have a major interest in. It also, as I understand it, commits the Europeans to funding a significant part of the Ukrainian reconstruction. That should be part of the incentive for Ukrainians to agree to this. So the Europeans may have been treated as if they're superfluous to this agreement, but they're not. They're actually, their interests are very core. The idea that one could promise to Putin and to Russia that Russia will be integrated into the global economy if Europe is offside, I think is not a realistic one. You just have to think of how Iran was promised that it would be integrated into the global economy after the nuclear deal under President Obama, and that didn't happen for a whole lot of reasons, even though the U.S. administration really wanted to see it.
Meghan, I just want to step in with some breaking news here that just crossed the terminal. A red headline on Nvidia, of all companies, of course, a big newsmaker this week, for the better with regard to its earnings report. It was dogged in the sell-off yesterday. It's back up today and rising on a headline. Nvidia shares climbing to session high as U.S. officials have early discussions about whether to allow the company to sell its H200 artificial intelligence chips to China. The H20s here pretty interesting moment to see Nvidia shares now really taking off on this news, up almost 2%, more than $3. Broadcom is just barely positive right now, and AMD is up about 0.5%. A redhead on Nvidia. It's something that we're going to be talking about here with regard to export controls and national security, whether we're talking about China or Saudi Arabia. Michelle, the stories seem to start bumping into each other here.
Well, for sure. And it all goes back to this argument of tech transfers, and can you always be sure that these pledges can remain in place and provide the national security protections that we need.
Meghan O'Sullivan, of course, coming from her role as former Deputy National Security Advisor, probably has some thoughts about this, Meghan. I don't mean to sneak up with you on that, but there are concerns here in Washington that we're mortgaging our national security when it comes to providing AI chips like these, F-35s to Saudi Arabia. Where do you fall on it?
Yeah, I think this is a very large concern on the part of Washington. I think some of it goes, I'm aware, like some of this goes to how far ahead you think China is. Is it actually very close to reaching or matching the U.S. capability when it comes to these chips and it comes to the development of AI? And if you think it is right on America's heels, then maybe you think allowing them to import very high-end chips is not going to change the landscape very much. But I am much more sympathetic to the argument that America still has a substantial lead, and keeping high-end chips from China for as long as we can is probably in our national security interests. Now, that doesn't mean that we can keep China from developing AI and that it won't make progress over time, but export controls have been a very important part of our ability to maintain a technological edge, which I believe the U.S. still maintains.
Well, Meghan, there's also this kind of prosperity argument on the part of particularly those from Silicon Valley that say, including Jensen Huang, that say that you can provide this technology with the protections and actually the benefits outweigh any of those risks, which they see as diminished. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think how I would respond to that is I would like to see some more data on that. I think Jensen Huang, clearly has an interest in expanding sales into China for reasons that are clear. And whether or not this is a prosperity argument in the sense, a global prosperity argument, I think really overlooks the key dynamic in the global international system, which is the competitive dynamic between the United States and China. And that dynamic is not going to be glossed over. It's not going to be diminished simply because we lift export controls on our most sensitive technologies. That dynamic is going to be maintained and be one of the fiercest competitions in the global arena for the coming years. And technology is the key component of that competition between the U.S. and China. And I think, selling high-end chips is not going to make that dynamic disappear. It just might yield one of America's competitive edges.
Well, Meghan, as I understand, I don't want to turn away from this conversation, which is an important one. But when we look at South Africa today, this week, we're headed into a weekend where the U.S. will not be present at the G20. You've done a lot of work at the Belfer Center at what you call the middle powers. I want to know, what is your reaction to that? How do you frame this snub in the context of what it means for the world, middle powers, and for the U.S.?
So thanks for mentioning the work that we do here at Belfer on middle powers. It's a new project that really acknowledges there are a large number of powerful countries. For those of you my age and older, certainly we used to think about non-aligned powers, and they weren't really consequential. But middle powers today are those countries that have prospered over the last 30 years. The Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa's, Indonesia's, others that actually have a real influence on the global economy, have an influence on global issues like climate and trade and technology. And they are core to the G20. And so for the U.S. to snub the G20, I think is not very forward-looking, because right now the U.S. and China are involved not only in that competitive dynamic with one another, they're involved in competing for the alliance, the friendship, and the sympathy of these middle powers who matter more and more.
Meghan, thank you so much. The former Deputy National Security Advisor, Director of the Harvard Belfer Center, Meghan O'Sullivan. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Michelle Jamrisko. This is Bloomberg.